Hi guys, today we are reading The Assault, and we are reading the entire second episode.
Yeah, I'm assistant number 2, everyone.
We are joined with Kunj today.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for having me on your podcast.
All the rest is postscript. The cloud of ash that rises into the stratosphere from the volcano circles around the earth and continues to rain down on all its continents for years. In May, a few days later, after liberation, having received no news yet of Anton's parents and Peter, Van Lempt left early in the morning for Harlem to try to find out what had happened. Apparently, they had been kept under arrest, though this was not customary during such reprisals. But even if they had been taken to a concentration camp in Vaud or Amsterdam, they should have been freed by now. Only the survivors of the German camps had not yet returned home. That afternoon, Anton went into town with his aunt. Amsterdam looked like a dying man who suddenly flushes open his eyes and miraculously comes back to life. Everywhere, flags at windowsills in need of paint. Everywhere, music and dancing and crowds rejoicing in the streets were glass and thistles grew between the pavement. Pale, starved people, laughing, crowded about fat Canadians wearing berets instead of caps, dressed not in gray, black, or green, but in beige or light brown uniforms that did not encase them tightly like armor, but hung loose and easy, like peacetime clothes, showing hardly any difference between soldiers and officers. Jeeps and armored cars were being padded like holy objects. Whoever could speak English not only became part of the heavenly kingdom that had come down to earth, but perhaps even received a cigarette. Boys his own age sat triumphantly on top of car radiators marked with white stars surrounded by circles. Yet he himself did not take part. Not because he was worried about his parents or Peter, for he never thought about that, but more because none of this was really part of him or ever would be.
His entire universe had become that other one, which now, fortunately, had come to an end, and about which he never wanted to think again. Nevertheless, it was a part of him, so that, all in all, he didn't have much left. At dinner time, they returned home, and he went to his room, where he was quite comfortable by now. His uncle and his aunt were childless and treated him as if he were their own son, or really with more consideration and less friction than if he had been their real child. At times, he wondered what it would be like to go back and live with his parents in Harlem, and this thought confused him so much that he quickly put it aside. He liked being at his aunt and uncle's house on Apollon precisely because he did not feel like their son. His uncle had the habit of always knocking before he entered. When Anton looked at his face, he saw at once the news he had brought. The steel clamp that protected his uncle's pant leg on the bicycle was still around his right ankle. He sat on the desk chair and told Anton to be prepared for very sad news. His father and his mother had never gone to prison. They had been shot that night, along with 29 other hostages. Nobody knew what had become of Peter, so there was still hope for him. His uncle had been to the police, but they did not know of anyone except the hostages. Then he had gone to the neighbors on the quay. No one was home at the Arts in Bide V. The Kortwegs were home but refused to receive him. Finally, it was the Boomers who told him the news. Mr. Boomer had seen it. Van Lempt did not go into details. Anton did not ask for any. He sat on his bed with the wall on his left and stared down at the flame-like shapes in gray linoleum. He had the feeling that he had known it all along. His uncle told him that the Boomers were very glad to hear he was still alive. Van Lempt pulled the clamp off his ankle and held it in his hand. It had the shape of a horseshoe. Of course, he said, Anton would continue to live here.
Not till June did they learn that Peter had been shot on the same evening. By then, it seemed like a message from prehistoric times. Hard to imagine. For Anton, that disaster of 5 months between January and June 1945 was incomparably longer than the distance between June of 1945 and the present day. It was on this distortion of time that he later blamed his inability to explain to his children what the war had been like. His family had escaped from his memory, had retreated to a forgotten region of which he had only a brief and random glimpse. As when he looked out the window in school or out the rear platform on a trolley car. A dark region of cold and hunger and shooting, blood, flames, shouts, prison cells, hermetically sealed somewhere deep inside of him. At such moments, it was as if he remembered a dream, but not so much what the dream had been about, as simply the fact that it had been a nightmare. Yet, at the core of that hermetic darkness, now and then, flashed a single source of blinding light, the fingertips of the girl caressing his face. Whether she had anything to do with the assault and what had happened to her, he did not know. He had no desire to know. He finished the gymnasium as a fair to middling student and went on to medical school. By then, he had been published about the occupation, but he didn't bother to read any of it, or any of the novels and stories about those days. Nor did he go to the State Institution for War Information, where he might have found out all that was known about the death of Fake Plogue, and exactly how Peter had met his death. The family of which he had been a member and had been exterminated once and for all. It was enough to be aware of this. All he knew was that the assault had never been brought to trial, for in that case he would have been questioned, and the German man with the scar in the long coat had never been tracked down. But perhaps he had already been removed from Gestapo. Yeah, you go.
Never mind, he is the least important character in this drama. He must have acted more or less on his own initiative. To set houses on fire in places where Nazis had been shot was not unusual, but to execute the inhabitants as well, that kind of terror had been practiced only in Poland and Russia. In those countries, however, Anton would have been killed too, even if he had still been in the cradle. But things don't vanish all that easily. In September 1952, while he was in second year of medical school, a fellow student invited him to a birthday party in Harlem. He had not been back since he left 7 years before with the German convoy. At first, he didn't plan to go, yet all day he kept thinking about it. Suddenly, after lunch, he grabbed a novel by a young Harlem writer that would do for a present. Though he had actually meant to read it himself, and took the trolley to the station. He felt like someone going to a whorehouse for the first time. Beyond the sandy embankment, the train passed under a huge steel pipe that was vomiting a thick steel-gray mud onto the former Pete Diggins on the other side of the street. The burnt-out truck had been removed. He watched the traffic on the street, his chin resting in the palm of his hand. The trolley, too, was running again. As he passed halfway, he saw the silhouette of Harlem, still very much the way Ruysdael painted it. Although in those days there were woods and fields where laundry lay bleaching, where Anton's house later stood. But the sky was the same massive Alps of cloud with beams of light leaning against them. What he saw was not just any city like so many others in the world. It was as different as he himself was from the other people.
Anyone watching him sit on the pale wooden bench in third class, peering out the compartment window of a train confiscated from the Reichsbahn, would see a 20-year-old with sleek dark hair that kept falling over his forehead, which he would toss back with a brief movement of his head. For some reason, the gesture was attractive, perhaps because it was repeated so often that it implied a certain amount of patience. He had dark eyebrows and a smooth, nut-colored complexion, somewhat darker around the eyes. He wore gray slacks, a heavy blue blazer, a club tie, and a shirt whose pointed collar tips turned upward. The smoke that he blew with pursed lips at the window pane clung to the glass in a thin mist for a moment. He took the trolley to his friend's house. The friend, too, lived in Harlem South. But since his family hadn't moved there till after the war, they wouldn't question Anton about the past. When the trolley swerved into the house, he caught sight for a minute of the former Oxmanderture. The trench and barbed wire had disappeared. There was nothing left but a dilapidated abandoned hotel, its windows nailed shut. The garage, a restaurant before the war, was now in ruins. Probably his friend had no idea what kind of establishment this had once been. "So you came after all," he said as he opened the door. "Sorry I'm late." "Never mind. Did you have trouble finding it?" "Not really." In the garden behind the house, a long table stood under the tall trees. It held potato salad and other delicacies, bottles, stacks of plates, silver. On another table were the presents to which Anton added his book. The guests stood around about the lawn. After he had introduced to everyone, he joined the slightly inebriated group that he knew from Amsterdam.
Holding their glass of beer in the front of their chests, they formed a circle by the edge of the water. Like Anton, they wore blazes that hung loose on their bodyish frames. The leader of the group was his friend's older brother, a dentistry student in Utrecht, who wore a huge shapeless black shoe on his right foot. He was holding forth, "The fact is, you're all softies. That's natural. All you got on your mind, except for jerking off, of course, is how you avoid the draft. That's easy for you to say, Garrett Jan. They obviously don't want you with that paw of yours. Well, I'll tell you something else, you jerk. If you had 1 ounce of guts, you'd not only join the army, but volunteer to go to Korea. None of you have any idea of what's going on over there. The barbarians are storming the gates of Christian civilization." He wagged his index finger at them. Compared to them, the fascists were mere boys. Just read, Colster. Why don't you go yourself, kicking their brains with that ridiculous shoe of yours, Quasimodo? Touché, Garrett Jan laughed. Korea is getting to be just like the University of Amsterdam, commented another, a haven for misfits. Gentlemen, said Garrett Jan, raising his glass, let's drink to the downfall of red fascism as at home and abroad. I do keep thinking that I should have joined, said a boy who hadn't. You want a guest appearance?
Yeah. Neil, you want a guest appearance?
Hadn't picked up the drift of the conversation. But apparently there are lots of former SSers in the army. I heard that if they enlist, they go off scot-free. So what? There's more in it than that for SSers in Korea. They can really get ahead. Get ahead, thought Anton. Really get ahead. Between two boys, he peered at the opposite shore of the pond, at the peaceful lanes where people bicycled, and someone was taking a dog out. Villas were there too. Somewhat beyond them, though, not visible from here, was the nursery school, where he used to stand in line at the central kitchen.
A bit farther down and toward the left, behind the vacant lots, was the place where it had all happened. He shouldn't have come. He should never have returned to Harlem. He should have buried all that, the way one buries the dead. A certain dreamer is peering into the distance, said Jan, and when Anton looked up at him, yes, you, Steenschwick. Well, what's your opinion? What do you mean? Are we going to face up to the communists, or are we going to pussyfoot around them? I've had my share, said Anton. At that moment, someone started a record on the veranda. Thanks for their memory. He smiled at the coincidence, but when he saw the others hadn't noticed, shrugged briefly and walked away from them. The music blended with the dappled shade below the trees and somehow stirred up his memories. He was in Harlem. It was a warm autumn day, perhaps the last one of the year, and he was once more in Harlem. This was all wrong, and he resolved never to come back again, even if he were offered a job here at 100,000 gulden a year. But since he happened to be here, he wanted to say goodbye once and for all. Now, immediately. Are you, young man? Startled. Oh, and you, young man. Startled, he looked up into the face of his host, a short man with gray hair brushed to the side, wearing an ill-fitting suit with pants too short for him, as was the fashion with a certain element of Dutch upper classes. Beside him stood his wife, a refined lady with a crooked back, so frail, all in white, that she looked as if at any moment she might fly away in a puff of dust. Yes, Mr. Van Lentep, he said with a smile, although he had no idea what the question was. Are you having fun? I'm doing my best.
Good for you, though you don't look very happy, my friend. Yes, he said. I think I'll take a tour around the block. Please don't mind me. Oh, we don't mind anything. Free and easy. Go ahead and stretch your legs. It clears the head. Between tea-drinking family members sitting in the white garden chairs, he found his way into the home and out to the street. He turned into a side street and walked along the pond. When he had crossed to the other side, he looked back at... One second.
They sure felt like it.
Okay, don't mind that interruption. Where were we? The music that drifted over the water sounded even louder from here. At that moment, Garrett Jan noticed him. Hey, over there, Steenwick, you asshole. The recruiting office is in the other direction. With a wave of his hand, Anton let him know that he got the joke. After that, he did not look back again. He didn't take the path across the lots, but went along the street, which, round the bend, turned into the quarry. This was all wrong, what he was doing. It was a mistake. The criminal returns to the scene of the crime. With sudden excitement, he recognized the Harrington pattern of the brick pavement. He had never noticed it in the old days, but now he saw it and realized that it had always been there. When he came to the water, he kept his eyes focused on the other side. The farmhands' cottages, the little farms, the mill, the meadows, nothing had changed. The clouds had vanished. The cows grazed peacefully in the evening sun. Beyond the horizon, Amsterdam, which he now knew better than Harlem, but only in the way one knows someone else's face better than their own. He crossed to the sidewalk that had since been laid out along the embankment, walked on a little bit, and only then jerked his face away from the water in the other direction.
Should we keep going? She said like 15
How long
minutes.
is this episode?
There's like
man?
a ton. We're
I
like.
mean, she wanted us to rate a whole episode. We still got 13
how long
pages.
Did she say? How long did she say?
Do you want to go check? Pause it real quick.
Okay. I loved you that part. Okay. The three houses, an open space between the first and second one like a missing tooth. Only the fence was still there. It surrounded a thick vegetation of nettles and bushes with a few slender trees among them. Like in some 16th century painting that had an angel on a hilltop and an ill-tempered crow staring at a monstrous little man. Many more weeds grew there than on the empty lots in the back, perhaps because the ashes made it especially fertile. According to his uncle, in the hills of northern France, there were places like this among the fields, places the farmers left unplowed because they were mass graves for the First World War. In the shade, under the nettles, there were probably still some bricks, fragments of the walls, foundations, and down in the earth, the cellar, his old scooter no doubt stolen out of it. Everything filled with rubbish, even though he had not thought about them. These ruins had been here all these years without interruption. Slowly tilting his head a bit to the side, tossing his hair back now and then, he walked toward the spot where he had sat in the car and once more looked at the empty space. While sparrows made a racket in the small trees, he saw the houses rise in front of him, built out of transparent bricks. The window panes and the thatch as he remembered them. The bay window above it all, the little balcony of the bedroom. The pointed roof, and to the left, the dormer window of his room. On the board under the balcony were the letters, Carefree. The name of the Courtweg's houses had disappeared, painted over. But Hideaway and Bideaway were still there. He looked at the spot where Plug had been lying.
We have a feature.
Yes, new feature, Karan Verma. Yeah, go, there.
Here?
Ages ago.
Wait. Oh, okay. Ages ago. He saw him prone on the patterned bricks as if drawn in contour with fluorescent chalk by the police. He was tempted to touch the spot, to lay his hands on it, and this worried him. Nevertheless, he did slowly cross the street. But before he reached the other side, he saw something move at the window of Hideaway. Looking closely, he recognized Miss Boomer. She had already noticed him and waved. He was upset. Not once had it occurred to him that she or any of the others might still bro. I can't.
Go, read.
At 7.
Might still be living
That
there.
was inconceivable. He cared only about the place, not the people. Whenever he had thought about it, the Boomers, the Courtwegs, and the Arts had not been present. That the people, too, had remained the same. He wanted to run away, but she was already standing in the doorway. Donnie! He could have still escaped. Probably it was his good manners that made him walk with a smile towards the garden gate towards her. Hello, Miss Boomer. Tawny, my boy. She took his hand and put her other arm around his waist, holding him with a brief little squeezes against her, awkwardly, as if she had not embraced anyone in a long time. She had grown much older and smaller, her hair now completely white with a tightly curled permanent. She would not let go of his hand. Come in, she said, pulling him across the threshold. There were tears in her eyes. I'm afraid I should really... Look who's here, she called through the door of the front parlor. In an armchair, dating from the previous century, which at that time had not become modern again, but was still old-fashioned, the way it is now, for the second time, sat Mr. Boomer, grown so old and thin that the crown on his head no longer reached the wood carving on the high-backed chair. His legs were hidden beneath a brown plaid blanket.
On top of it lay his hands in continuous motion. His head constantly nodded. When Anton held out his hand, Mr. Beamer came toward him like a wounded, fluttering bird. Anton held it, but felt only the cool, feeble likeness of a hand. "How are you doing, Hans?" he asked in a gentle, broken voice. Anton looked at Mrs. Beamer. She made a gesture as if to say, "This is the way things are." "Fine, Mr. Beamer," he said. "Thank you. And how are you?" Putting the question seemed to have exhausted Mr. Beamer. He nodded and said nothing more, continuing to observe Anton with small, watery blue eyes. The corners of his mouth were damp and shiny. The skin of his face was as thin as wax paper. Whatever hair he had left was straw-colored, the way Anton remembered it. Perhaps he had been a redhead long ago. A dark brown radio made of bakelite and shaped like an egg, half lengthwise, was broadcasting a program for children. Miss Beamer had started clearing the table. Apparently, they had finished supper. "Let me help you." "No, just make yourself comfortable and I'll fix you a cup of coffee." He sat, straddling the exotic stool by the fireplace, a camel saddle which had been familiar to him all his life. Mr. Beamer did not take his eyes off him. Anton smiled and looked about. Nothing had changed. At the dining room table stood the 4 black lacquered chairs, with their intricately carved, pointed backs, rather gothic and creepy. They used to frighten him when he came here for tea and cake. Above the door still hung the crucifix with a twisted, yellowed corpus. There was a sour smell in the room. All the windows were closed tight, so they were connecting doors with the leaded panes. "Weedy what?" chanted the disguised woman voice on the radio. "I see you, but I pick you not."
Suddenly, Miss Boomer belched and looked about him in surprise, as if he heard something unexpected. "Why didn't you come sooner, Tawny?" Miss Boomer called from the kitchen. He got up and went to her. From the hall, he could see that their bed stood in the back room, probably because Mr. Boomer could no longer climb the stairs. From a whistling kettle, she poured a thin trickle of water over the coffee. "This is the first time I've returned to Harlem. He hasn't been well at all lately," Miss Boomer said softly. "Just pretend you don't notice." "Of course, what else?" Should I burst out laughing and exclaim, "Don't talk nonsense," but actually, that would probably have been better, he realized. "Obviously," he said. Do you know that you haven't changed at all? Oh my god, you are even taller than your father, but I recognize you at once. Are you still living in Amsterdam?" "Yes, Miss Boomer. I knew that because your uncle came right after the liberation. My husband saw you being driven off in that German car, and we had no idea whether you were still alive. No one knew about anything in those dreadful times. You can't imagine how often we talked about you. Come." They returned to the living room. When Miss Boomer saw Anton, he once more held out his hand, and Anton shook it in silence. Miss Boomer laid the Persian cloth, whose pattern he still remembered, back on the table. She poured the coffee. Do you take sugar and milk?" "Just milk, please." She poured some hot milk out of the small saucepan into the wide low cup. "To think that you should never have wanted to see this place again," she said as she handed him the cup.
But actually, I can understand it. It was just too awful, all that. Someone else had been here several times and stood looking at us from across the street. Who was it? No idea. A man. She handed him a cookie tin. "A biscuit? Please." "Are you sure you're comfortable there? Why don't you sit at the table?" "But this is my usual place," he laughed. "Don't you remember when your husband read to me out the 3 Musketeers?" Miss Boomer turned off the radio and sat sideways at the table. She laughed along with him, but a minute later her laughter died and her face turned red. Anton looked away. With thumb and finger, he took the skin off his milk, exactly in the middle, and lifted it slowly. It folded up like an umbrella, and he draped it over the edge of his saucer. He took a sip of the weak brew. Now something was expected of him, a question about long ago. It should be the opening move, no doubt, but he has no desire to begin. They probably thought that he was terribly disturbed by the past, dreamed about it every night, but the fact was, he almost never thought about it. As he sat before these 2 old people in this room, at least one of them must imagine him to be quite different from what he was. He looked at Mrs. Boomer. Once more there were tears in her eyes. "Does Mr. Kortweg live here?" he asked. "He moved away a few weeks ago after the liberation. No one knows where. He never came to say goodbye. Neither did Karen." That was very odd, right, Bert? It was as if she wanted to try once more to involve him in the conversation. Mr. Boomer nodding his head seemed to be a sign of agreement. An assertive nodding that would not end till he died. How strange.
He hadn't been offered any coffee, no doubt because the cup would be empty before it reached his mouth. She must be feeding him when there was no company. 9 years we were neighbors, said Miss Boomer. We
went through the whole war together, and then suddenly they disappeared without a word. I'll never quite understand people. For days, there was a pile of aquariums left standing on the doorstep to be cleared out by the garbage collector. "Those are terrariums," said Anton. "Those glass things. Atch." He was a very unhappy man. He came by here a few times right after the death of his wife. "Do you still remember Miss Kortweg?" "Vaguely. Not really." "That was in about 42 or 43. How old were you then?" 10. "There's a nice young couple with 2 children living there now. Those terrariums." He remembered Kortweg as a big, surly man who would barely say hello to him. As soon as he came home, he would take off his jacket and roll up his shirt sleeves in a particular way, toward the inside, so that they looked like puff sleeves gathered around his hairy arms. Afterward, he usually went upstairs to do something mysterious that aroused Anton's curiosity. Karin often sat sunning herself in a desk chair, her dark blonde hair piled on top of her head and her skirt raised way above her knees, so that sometimes he even caught a glimpse of her.
It's fittingly freaky for you, bro.
She had pale blue, somewhat protruding eyes, and nicely shaped, which reminded him of the cross-section of a plane's wings as he pictured in Fire's world. At night, when he lay thinking about her in bed, he would I think you say that part.
I'm not reading this chapter. We spent 2 minutes on a page.
He had no idea what to do about it, however, it would end by falling asleep. Whenever he kept the hole in the hedge into the Kortweg's garden, Karin was willing to interrupt her sunning to play a board game with him. She was just a bit cross-eyed, which was very attractive.
You have to do one more. One day, after she had sworn him to secrecy, she showed him her father's hobby. Upstairs in the back room, 10 or 15 terrariums with lizards in them stood about on small tables. Weirdly silent, their bodies S-shaped, their small hands holding onto tree bark. The creatures stared at him out of a patch as deep and immovable as themselves. Though some of them seemed to be grinning broadly, their eyes spoke a different language, of a gravity so immovable and undisturbed as to be almost unbearable. Anton set his teacup on the mantelpiece next to the clock. From the way Miss Boomer talked about Kortweg, he concluded that she had no idea what had happened with Ploeg's body. Apart from the Kortwegs himself, he was probably the only one who knew. He had not even told his uncle and aunt. Perhaps the fewer the people who knew how absurd it had all been, the less absurd it would actually be. And next door, he said, Miss and Mrs. Arts. They're still living there, but they've never even said hello to us. You never went there either, remember? They keep to themselves. The other day, too, Mr. Glovenveld wanted to get something done about all those weeds next door. Grovenveld, the family that's living at the Kortwegs now. You must have noticed all the stuff that's going on where your house used to be. Yes, said Anton. All those seeds blow over all over the place and into our garden. It's impossible to keep up with the weeding. He thought the community should do something about it. He wrote a letter and we signed it, but Mr. Arch pretended he wasn't home. Can you imagine? It wouldn't have been any trouble. She looked at him, offended. You owe me a page.
Anton nodded. It certainly is amazing, all those weeds. From his tone, Miss Boomer apparently got the impression that she had not been very tactful, Suddenly insecure, she said, I understand, Miss Beamer. Life continues. You're such an understanding boy, Tony, she said, glad that he had taken the problem away from her. She stood up. Another cup of coffee? No, thank you. She poured herself some. You remind me of that poor Peter, she said. You don't look like him at all, but he was just as understanding. Always helpful, always friendly. She let the lump of sugar, which she had been holding in the claws of the silver tongs, fall back into the sugar bowl. I thought his face was the worst. His faith was the worst, somehow. That sweet boy, your father and mother too, of course, but Peter, he was even younger than you are now. I thought it was so awful when I heard about it. I saw him try to help that man, Ploeg. After all, it wasn't certain that he was dead. Of course, he was a scoundrel. I'm quite aware of that, but he was still human. A boy like Peter with a heart of gold, it cost him his life. Anton lowered his head and nodded. With his hands, he caressed the brown leather of the stool made from the camel saddle. It too would have gone up in flames if Peter had had his way. If everything had happened according to Peter's plan, everything in this house would have been reduced to ashes. Mr. Bumer's armchair, Miss Bumer's kitchen, the crucifix, the macabre chairs around the dining table. In that case, the troublesome weeds would have been growing on this spot, whereas his parents would still be living next door and carefree. Mr. and Miss Bumer would probably have been too old to be shot, but what would have happened to Peter? He would have had to do his military service. In 47, during the police action in Indonesia, he would have been part of the 7th of December Division. Maybe he would have set villages on fire. Maybe he would have died there.
Unimaginable all that. Peter had never been more than 17 years old, 3 years younger than Anton now, and that too was hard to imagine. He, Anton, was forever the younger brother, even if he should live to be 80. It was all inconceivable. Mr. Beamer made the sign of the cross. It's always the best ones, she said softly, that God calls to him first. Then Fake Plug was the best of all of us, thought Anton. Yes, he said. God's ways are unfathomable. Why should we have been killed in front of your house? It might just as well have happened here, or at the Courtwegs. We've often wondered about that, my husband and I. He always used to say that God had spared us. But how should we take that? Because that would mean he didn't spare you. And why shouldn't he have spared you? And then your husband answered, said Anton, feeling that perhaps he was going a bit too far, that it was because we were heathens. In silence, Miss Bumer plucked at the tablecloth with a sugar tong. For the third time, tears welled in her eyes. That darling Peter, that sweet father and mother of yours, I can still see him. Your father in his black coat, with his bowler hat and rolled-up umbrella, he always looked down at the ground. When he went out with your mother, he always walked one step ahead of her, the way Indonesians do. They certainly never did anyone any harm. Pickles are just like crocodiles, Mr. Beamer said suddenly. His wife and Anton looked at him, but he stared back at them innocently. Miss Beamer once more lowered her eyes to her hands. What they must have experienced. Surely your uncle told you about when your mother flew at that fellow, simply slaughtered like beasts. It was as if an electric shock passed through Anton from his neck to his tailbone. Miss Beamer, he stammered, could you please... Of course, my boy, I understand. It was all so terrible. He must leave at once. He looked at his watch without noticing what time it was. Goodness, I have to go. I hope you don't mind. I just came by for a second. Of course, my boy. She stood up and smothered the front of her dress with both hands. Smoothed. Is it really the first time that you've been back to Harlem, Tawny? Really? Then you should walk by the monument and have a look. Monument, he said, surprised. There, said Miss Beamer, and pointed to a corner of the room where a small table stood, a vase of tall white plumes like ostrich feathers, or perhaps they were ostrich feathers. Okay. On the place where it all happened. I never heard about it. How is that possible? Said Miss Beamer. It was unveiled about 3 years ago by a burgomaster. Lots of people were invited. We had hoped to see you then. My husband was still quite all right at the time. But I didn't see your uncle either. Shall I come along? If you don't mind, I'd rather... Of course, she said, and took his hand in both of hers. You need to be alone with it. Goodbye, Tawny. It was so wonderful to see you again, and I'm sure it was for my husband, too. Even though he can't show it now. Hand in hand, they looked at Mr. Beamer. Exhausted, he had closed his eyes. She told Anton that his hands were just as large as his father's. Then they took leave of each other. He promised he would return soon, but he knew that he would never see these people again. He would never come back to Harlem. As he stepped out of the front door, he was struck by the brightly lit open space to his left where his house used to be. Across from the wilderness, he saw the new owners in the garden of the former home at last. A thin, blond man with a little Indonesian wife, both about 35. The man was playing soccer with a little boy as she looked on with a baby in her arms. It was the lilac hour. The sun had just gone down. The quay and the meadows were bathed in a light that belonged neither to day nor night. It came out of another world where nothing ever moved or changed, and it lifted everything out of the ordinary. At the other end of the quay, where the road parted from the water, he saw a man-high hedge skirting the sidewalk that had not existed 7 years ago. There was no traffic, and he crossed the road on a diagonal toward the monument. The hedge, about a meter wide, was made of rhododendrons, whose leaves glistened in the magic light. It surrounded a low cement wall. On the square central base stood a grayish statue of a staring woman, hair hanging loose and arms reaching out. It was carved in a somber, symmetrical static, almost Egyptian style. Underneath was the date, with the words, "They fell for Queen and Fatherland." To the right, on the two bronze plaques at the side, were the names of the dead in 4 rows. The last row read, J.R. Sorgdrager, W.L. Steenswick, D. Steenswick Van Lempt, J. Takes, K.H.S. Verman, A. Van der Zand. Anton's eyes were riveted on the names. There they were, recorded and preserved in a bronze alphabet. The letters not even made of bronze, but in a bronze negative. The man who had jumped handcuffed out of the truck, his mother, the only woman, his father, the only one born in the last century. This was all that remains of them now, except for a few photographs still preserved by his uncle and aunt. Nothing was left but these names, and himself. Their graves had never been found. Perhaps the Provisional War Monument Committee had debated whether these names really belonged here. Perhaps some of the officials had pointed out that the Steenswicks were, after all, not among the hostages, and were not really killed by a firing squad, but simply murdered like animals. At which, the officials of the Central Committee may also have questioned whether they deserved to be on the monument. At which, a concession, perhaps the officials from the Provisional Committee had managed to obtain the exclusion of Peter. He belonged, at least in a broader sense, to those who had died as armed resistors, for those who were other monuments. Hostages, members of the underground, Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, they shouldn't just be mixed up together. For God's sake, the end result would be a total mess. The towpath was still there. The water was no longer frozen. When he saw that Miss Bumer still stood watching him behind the bay window, he did not return the way he had come. Neither did he return to Van Lemp's party. He took the first train to Amsterdam. When he got home, his aunt and his uncle were still at the table, just finished with dinner. The lamp was lit, a bit put out. His uncle asked why he hadn't called to say he'd be late. "I went to Harlem," said Anton. His uncle and aunt exchanged glances. The table was set for him, and he sat down in his place. He picked up a piece of lettuce with his fingers and, tilting his head backwards, dropped it into his mouth. "Shall I fry you an egg?" asked his aunt. He shook his head, swallowed the lettuce, and asked his uncle, "Why didn't you ever tell me there was a monument standing on our quay?" Van Lemp set down his cup of coffee, wiped his mouth, and looked him straight in the eye. "I told you that, Anton." "When did you?" 3 years ago. It was unveiled in 1939. There was an invitation. I asked if you wanted to go, but you didn't." "I remember exactly what you said." Miss Van Lempt filled a plate with salad and put it in front of him. "You said they could go to hell with their monument for all you cared." "Don't you remember?" asked Van Lempt. Anton shook his head and kept silent. He looked at the white tablecloth and slowly drew 4 lines in it with his fork. For the first time, he felt a kind of fear. Something sucking him in, a deep hole into which things fell without reaching the bottom, as when someone throws a stone into a well and never hears it land. At a time when he still thought about such things, he had wondered what would happen if he drilled a tunnel right through the center of the earth and then jumped in, wearing a fireproof suit. After a certain amount of time that could be determined mathematically, he would arrive, feet first, at the antipode, though he would not quite reach the surface. He would come momentarily to a standstill, then he would disappear once more, upside down into the depths. After many years, also mathematically calculable, he would at last and remain floating, weightless, at the center of the earth, when he would be able to reflect upon the state of things in eternity.